The history of the vase. A story written by Abraham. Abraham, having received the commandment of Yahweh, writes in a scroll the events that gave rise to the history known as the history of a vase, which tells the facts that framed the great liberation that the Lord made through Abraham, his pastors and allies. See Chrono 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 1. Abraham is informed of the battle in which Lot and many are taken captive. Abraham receives commandments from the Eternal in order to effect the great liberation, that is, to summon and prepare his shepherds, and prepare a vase with special characteristics. When I was resting under the shadow of the Mamber oak next to my tent, when I saw one of the servants of my nephew Lot arrive hurriedly. Almost out of breath, he began to tell me about the tragedy. There was a battle between the cities of the plains the day before, involving 4 kings against 5. As a result, Sodom was defeated and many of its inhabitants taken captive, including my nephew Lot. The news left me very distressed because at the same time that I felt it was necessary to come out to his aid, I was fragile, without any conditions. I was always a peaceful man and I hate those who shed blood. I have many servants, but few know how to handle swords and spears. Since childhood they have been trained as shepherds. Instead of swords and spears, they handle curbs with which they lead the flocks. Instead of shields, they carry glasses on their waists, always full of fresh water, to kill their thirst and refresh the afflicted sheep. Instead of wine to get drunk, they load subject to their belts small pots with olive oil, with which they anoint the wounds of the flock. Instead of resonating trumpets, they blow in small horns, with which they summon the flock to the corral. 3. Imagining what a battle would be like between my servants and the armies of those 5 victorious kings, I began to laugh. While I was reflecting, the voice of the one who always guides me echoed in my ears, saying, "For Abram, do not disparage the instruments of the shepherds, for they are sanctified by the fire of sacrifice, they will conquer the great liberation." 5. The Eternal began to give me orders, making me advance by faith, without knowing how such liberation was to be realized. 6. The first step was the convocation of all the shepherds who, leaving their flocks, went to the Mamre oak, bringing their pastoral instruments. There were a total of 600 pastors. 7. I ordered the jugs to be emptied, placing the oil in the jar. 8. After fulfilling this order, I asked that each one take the wool of a sheep, mixing it with the oil from the jugs. 9. After these things, Yahweh commanded me to take a large vase of clay, filling it halfway with olive oil. 10. At the end of this task, the Lord commanded me to make a long wick of wool, curling half in the oil and leaving the other part held on top of the vase. 11. After these things, Yahweh ordered me to light the fuse, with the fire of the altar. As I approached the sacred fire that still burned on the morning sacrifice, a small flame jumped towards the fuse, and little by little it was feeding on the oil, until it became a flare that could be seen from afar. Chapter 2. Abraham carries the vase on his shoulders. Sufferings and trials in his journey. Many do not bear shame and abandon Abraham. Unbelief of Sarah. One with the vase on my shoulders, I started a walk towards the cities of the plain, being accompanied by the shepherds. Then mockers began to emerge that, seeing me with that incandescent vase in broad daylight, began to say that I was crazy. As this news spread, many came to meet me, bringing advice for me to abandon that vase that would be able to destroy all my reputation and dignity in front of them all. 2. When I told them about the armies and about my joint mission with the shepherds, they concluded that in fact I was crazy. They tried to throw me the vase by force, but holding on to it, I prevented them from throwing it at me. 3. Embarrassed by all this, many pastors began to separate. Some returned to their tents while others joined those who laughed at my strange behavior. For feeling alone with that heavy vase on my shoulders, I began to anguish myself. I longed to find someone with whom I could share my experience, but everyone gave me disapproving looks. 5. I remembered Sarah, my beloved wife. In obedience to the voice of Yahweh we had traveled many ways, being Sarah always by my side, encouraging me to continue precisely in the most difficult moments. Certainly Sarah would bring me comfort and strength to continue firm, leading the vase of salvation. 6. While I was walking along the road thinking about Sarah, I saw her in the middle of the crowd. When I addressed her, I was surprised and discouraged to see in her eyes the same contempt of those who called me crazy for driving in the middle of the day the flame that had come off the altar. 7. Remembering Yahweh's order that I would have to free my nephew Lot, I walked alone along the road. When I put myself in the place of those who called me crazy, I gave them the reason because under normal conditions, no coherent person would leave the house, without a definite course, carrying a vase with a flare on the back, claiming to be marching against the armies of 5 kings, to free a relative. It really implies that it is the manifestation of great madness. Precisely so, under the grudge of all the humiliations and words that spoke against me, I was moving towards the unknown valley. 8. All that mockery was finally diminishing as I distanced myself from the Mamre oak. 9. Many doubts about my future began to come to my heart. He was sometimes afflicted with the thought of everything he had experienced from the convocation of the shepherds until that moment. It could be, in fact, demonstrations of madness. 10. Full of doubts, I began to think about the possibility of leaving the vase next to the road, returning to the altar. Those were the advice of some pastors and friends who, still in solitude, still came to meet me, advising me to return. There they said that I could again conquer the trust of the shepherds, returning to be, perhaps, even the same honorable priest as before. On the altar, they said, there was a fire much greater than the one I carried on my shoulders. Chapter 2. Abraham carries the vase on his shoulders. Sufferings and trials in his journey. Many do not bear shame and abandon Abraham. Unbelief of Sarah. One with the vase on my shoulders, I started a walk towards the cities of the plain, being accompanied by the shepherds. Then mockers began to emerge that, seeing me with that incandescent vase in broad daylight, began to say that I was crazy. As this news spread, many came to meet me, bringing advice for me to abandon that vase that would be able to destroy all my reputation and dignity in front of them all. 2. When I told them about the armies and about my joint mission with the shepherds, they concluded that in fact I was crazy. They tried to throw me the vase by force, but holding on to it, I prevented them from throwing it at me. 3. Embarrassed by all this, many pastors began to separate. Some returned to their tents while others joined those who laughed at my strange behavior. For feeling alone with that heavy vase on my shoulders, I began to anguish myself. I longed to find someone with whom I could share my experience, but everyone gave me disapproving looks. 5. I remembered Sarah, my beloved wife. In obedience to the voice of Yahweh we had traveled many ways, being Sarah always by my side, encouraging me to continue precisely in the most difficult moments. Certainly Sarah would bring me comfort and strength to continue firm, leading the vase of salvation. 6. While I was walking along the road thinking about Sarah, I saw her in the middle of the crowd. When I addressed her, I was surprised and discouraged to see in her eyes the same contempt of those who called me crazy for driving in the middle of the day the flame that had come off the altar. 7. Remembering Yahweh's order that I would have to free my nephew Lot, I walked alone along the road. When I put myself in the place of those who called me crazy, I gave them the reason because under normal conditions, no coherent person would leave the house, without a definite course, carrying a vase with a flare on the back, claiming to be marching against the armies of 5 kings, to free a relative. It really implies that it is the manifestation of great madness. Precisely so, under the grudge of all the humiliations and words that spoke against me, I was moving towards the unknown valley. 8. All that mockery was finally diminishing as I distanced myself from the Mamre oak. 9. Many doubts about my future began to come to my heart. He was sometimes afflicted with the thought of everything he had experienced from the convocation of the shepherds until that moment. It could be, in fact, demonstrations of madness. 10. Full of doubts, I began to think about the possibility of leaving the vase next to the road, returning to the altar. Those were the advice of some pastors and friends who, still in solitude, still came to meet me, advising me to return. There they said that I could again conquer the trust of the shepherds, returning to be, perhaps, even the same honorable priest as before. On the altar, they said, there was a fire much greater than the one I carried on my shoulders. 11. I was about to return when Sarah came to meet me, telling me about the contempt that many pastors threw at me. She was dismayed because all that dishonor also fell on her, to the point of not feeling more desires to remain next to that altar. 12. After alerting me, Sarah began telling me about a plan. We could, perhaps, move to a distant city, where we would forget all those vexations. 13. Forgetting the voice that had sent me on my way to the plain, I replied to my wife that I would be willing to accompany her anywhere, if she allowed me to take the vase. He would be our altar, heating and lighting our nights with his flame. 14. Upon hearing about the vase, Sarah became angry again, claiming not to understand my stubbornness by continuing to carry on her shoulders that symbol of shame and contempt. After telling me such words, he turned his back on me back to the store. Chapter 3. Abraham understands the meaning of the vase. Abraham protects the little flame from the cold winds. Many sheep follow Abraham. Abraham, walking alone, follows the trail. The armies mock Abraham and threaten the extermination of the captives. One distressed at not being able to realize Sarah's dream, I continued towards the uncertain future, being oriented only by the flame, whose brightness increased as the darkness grew denser. Then I began to meditate on that flame that accompanied me with its brightness and heat. 2. I was used to seeing the sacred fire enthroned on a great altar of stones, in the midst of the praises of many pastors, among whom I stood out as a teacher and priest. In those moments of adoration, I dressed in the best mantles, and asked the question of making the sacrifice, only when all my servants were gathered around me, to listen to my advice and warnings. At the time of the sacrifice, I lifted my drawn sword to the sky, and with frightening words, proclaimed the greatness of the Lord of armies, the Almighty God who rules over heaven and earth. Vibrating the sword in the air in a menacing movement, I represented in front of my shepherds the image of a severe God, who is always ready to repel any confrontation. After that demonstration of sovereignty and power, I took a sheep from the hands of a shepherd, and tied it on the altar. So that the divine wrath was very clear, I punctured on her neck, hitting her severely until I saw her perish. At that moment I descended from the altar, and remained waiting for the sacred fire that never stopped manifesting itself on the sacrifice. 3. I had learned since childhood to revere the sacred fire, believing that it was a visible revelation of Yahweh, the great invisible God. Until then, I saw it as a unique and indivisible fire. Now, by transporting in a humble jar the flame that had come off the altar, my thoughts stirred with the emergence of a new concept about the Creator, the concept of a suffering God who is able to part with the great Yahweh, represented by the sacred fire, to accompany the sinner in his journey. For repentant, I fell down in front of the vase and cried bitterly. I was now aware that all the zeal shown by the altar was aimed at the exaltation of my pride, and not the love of the one who accompanied me along the way. 5. Suddenly, I was reminded in my mind that the little flame that had come off the sacred fire was a representation of the Messiah, who would part with the great Yahweh, to be the God with us, companion in all our journeys. Upon this conviction, the flame rejoiced, becoming brighter and hotter. Chapter 4. Abraham is comforted by the arrival of his shepherds and allies. The shepherds learned to love the light of the vase. Loyalty of Abraham's allies. Guided by the divine voice, Abraham gives strategic instructions. Lot's lamp. Confusion and killing between the enemy armies. While trying to imagine what Yahweh could do to achieve such a miraculous liberation, I saw a group of shepherds coming in my direction, coming from Sodom. I thought at the beginning that they were the enemy shepherds who came to pluck the flock conquered with love. Such distrust soon disappeared, giving rise to a feeling of great joy, when I discovered that they were my faithful pastors. They approached in small groups of 12, reaching a total of 300 pastors. Looking at them, I could see in their countenance the signs of a great spiritual struggle that they had to face, to be on my side. They told me about the experience of many colleagues who, discouraged, had thrown the oil and wool out of their glasses, returning to their tents. They told me about how, on that previous night, they had learned to love the light of my vase, which for them became like a guiding star. 2. I was glad with the presence of my humble shepherds, when our Aner, Eskal and Manra arrived in the direction, accompanied by 15 armed men. They were faithful friends who, knowing the dangers we would face in that valley, came to our aid. So that we would not postpone the divine plan, I asked them to remain hidden until dawn, when they would receive guidance on how to participate in the mission. 3. I began to orient the shepherds, following the instructions of the divine voice that sounded to me from within the flame. The first task of the shepherds would be to take care of the flock until nightfall. For when I returned, I ordered that they tie the skeins of wool soaked in oil, on the tip of their curbs, placing them inside the glasses that should be kept suspended, face down. 5. I began to light them with the fire of my flare, until the 300 torches were burning, though hidden inside those vases. 6. I ordered 40 of my courageous shepherds who, at the time indicated by a sign that would be given, should advance silently towards the center of the camp, circling all the captives that lay in the middle of the troops' camp. At the same time, the remaining 260 shepherds should surround the entire camp, waiting for the signal to break the glasses with the horns. 7. Oriented by the voice of the flame, I indicated the signs. When the last torch went out in the camp, they should be attentive, since a small lamp would be lit by one of the captives. As soon as the lamp began to burn, everyone should run to their position, avoiding any noise so as not to be discovered. 8. The signal for them to break the glasses with the horns, raising the torch very high, would be to extinguish the lamp. 9. After those orientations, the 260 shepherds, hidden by the shadows of the night, scattered throughout the valley, and were waiting for the moment to place themselves around the camp. Meanwhile, the 40 were placed next to a more vulnerable passage, through which they would reach the captives. 10. It was already late at night when the torch of the last soldier was extinguished, a complete darkness and silence over the troops' camp. 11. Among the captives, there was a man on that night, who lived the greatest anguish of his life. It was my nephew who, after becoming the target of so many abuses and humiliations, had learned of the punishment that awaited them at dawn. 12 On that night, Lot had his thoughts turned to his uncle. He remembered with regret the moment he had left me next to the Mamre oak, moving to the Sodom countryside. In desperation, he felt the desire to see my face again and to apologize for having turned away from me. Just then, Lot was attracted by the glow of a torch burning on the hill. When he looked at the glow, he imagined he was having a vision, for it revealed the face of his dear uncle. 13 Wanting to show me his face, Lot felt in the midst of darkness until he found a small lamp he had brought in his saddlebag. Frustrated, he sensed that there was no oil in it. He concluded that the dry and dull lamp was a symbol of his empty and faithless life. 14 Without diverting his eyes from my face lit by the flame of the vase, in a desperate gesture of faith, Lot felt the wick of his lamp, discovering that there was an oil residue in it. Curving, he began to hurt the stones of the fire, until a spark jumped towards the fuse. Without knowing it, Lot was commanding with his gestures the steps to a great liberation. 15 When the 300 shepherds saw the dim glow of the lamp, they quickly headed towards their posts, and remained waiting to extinguish the small flame. 16 From the moment Lot got up with his tiny flame, I was looking into his eyes that looked at mine. I saw that his face brought signs of unspeakable anguish and ill-treatment. Likewise, I could read in his blue eyes that hope and faith had not yet left him. 17 The little fire in Lot's lamp, however, would not resist for long. It was necessary to turn it off to signal the great victory. 18 When darkness covered Lot's face again, my 300 shepherds lashed their horns against the vases that kept burning torches hidden. A great noise, like cavalry in combat, echoed everywhere, while the torches were suspended. The 300 horns used until then to lead the flock, now sounded like trumpets of conquerors. 19 The whole camp woke up in one jump, and not knowing how to escape from such a terrible investing that it started from the outside and inside, the soldiers began to fight among themselves, while my shepherds remained in their posts, sounding the horns. 20 The captives were very frightened at first, but little by little they became aware of the great liberation that was operating in their favor. 21 When it dawned, a scene of complete destruction was revealed before our eyes. The whole town was covered by thousands of bodies torn by their own swords and spears. Only a few managed to flee that death camp, but they were persecuted by my 18 allies who were armed, being reached in Hobah, which is to the left of Damascus. Meanwhile, the captives, now released, recovered all the riches from which they had been looted by enemies. Chapter 5. The Great Liberation represents the liberation of Israel in the last days. Abraham discovers that the Great Liberation was concretized in Rosh Hashanah. Abraham preaches the faith in the Messiah to the liberated captives, inviting them to purify themselves in water. Only 3 accept him. Abraham rejects the offer of the king of Sodom. Abraham and the faithful decide to commemorate the festival of Sukkot in Salem. The Pearls of the Vase. Festive welcome in Salem. The meeting of Abraham and Melchizedek. See Chrono. 1, 2 and 3. 1 From the top of the hill, while I vibrated with the joy of the captives on that morning of liberation, I heard the voice of Yahweh speaking to me in the middle of the flame. 2. This liberation that is concretized today represents the liberation that I have to operate in the last days, saving the remnants of your children from the siege of numerous nations that will ally themselves with Gog in order to destroy them. On that day when they triumph over my people, my indignation will be very great, and I will contend against it through the plague and the blood. Flooding rain, great rocks of hail, fire and brimstone I will make fall on him, on his troops and on his many towns that were with him. Thus I will magnify myself, justify my holiness and make myself known in the eyes of many nations, and they will know that I am the Lord. And on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem I will pour out the spirit of thanks and supplications. They will look at me whom they pierced, and will lament as one who laments for an only begotten son, and will cry for him as one who cries bitterly for the firstborn. On that day there will be an open source for David's house and for the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to remove sin and impurity. 3 Aware of the historical importance of that day of liberation, I took a calendar and looked with surprise, for it was Rosh Hashanah, or Trumpet Day. That was the first day of a new year. 10 days later the Yom Kippur would come, the day of the purification of sins. On the 15th, the Sukkot party, the joyous autumn harvest party, would take place. For the flame that for me had become a representation of the promised Messiah, went out the moment I descended to meet the shepherds and the many captives now released. Full of joy and admiration, everyone wanted to know how such a great liberation had become possible, only with the use of those torches and horns. I told them then about the importance of that fire that had been released from the altar, to free them in that valley, identifying it as the Savior Messiah. 5. Seeing that everyone carried the dirt of slavery in their bodies and mantles, I invited them to follow me to the Jordan River, where everyone could bathe for the purification of their sins. 6. Only 3 people attended the invitation, Lot and his 2 most recent daughters. The others returned contaminated to their homes. 7. Before leaving, the king of Sodom came to meet me, promising to give me all the wealth recovered that morning. I rejected his offer so that someone could never say that I enriched myself with that plunder. 8. We stayed camped on the banks of the Jordan River, near Jericho for 12 days. In those days of refreshment, everyone was free of impurities, leaving them in the waters of the Jordan. This was a special preparation for the Sukkot party that we decided to commemorate in Salem. 9. Full of joy, we started an upward march towards the city of Salem, unaware of the happy surprise that awaited us. I was still at the front with Lot and his 2 daughters by my side, and behind the 300 shepherds came, leading the great flock. 10. As we moved forward, I began to notice that my vase that had become empty at dawn became very heavy. As I lowered it, I looked surprised to discover within it many pearls of various sizes and glitters that mysteriously formed. 11. When we see the white city in the distance, we begin to hear sounds of a great party. Harmonious chords reverberated through the mountains as we advanced along the road. 12. My curiosity in knowing that city and its young king was immense, because from the mouth of many I had already heard about its greatness and fame. It was a kingdom different from all the others, where subjects were trained not in the handling of bows and arrows, but in the domain of musical instruments. Melchizedek, his young king, ruled everyone with a very special scepter, a lute for which he had paid a high price. 13. As the joy grew in me as we approached the city of the great king, we saw a crowd dressed in fine linen, pure and shining, coming out to meet us. They all brought musical instruments, while singing a victory hymn. In front of the crowd came a young man playing a lute, bringing a crown full of precious stones on his forehead, which shone under the clarity of the setting sun. I was certain that this was the acclaimed king of Salem. 14. At the time of our meeting, we were admired with the salutation they gave us. Leaning in front of me, Melchizedek said, 15. Blessed are you, Abraham, servant of the Most High God, who possesses the heavens and the earth, and blessed be the Most High God, who delivered your adversaries into your hands. Chapter 6. Great revelations of Melchizedek and his people. The victors are crowned. Upon being crowned, Abraham is moved to observe deep wounds in the hands of Melchizedek. Melchizedek promises to tell his story. Melchizedek, by breaking bread and wine, is honored. The 144 pearls as tithe. The instructions and prophecies of Melchizedek. One surprised by the festive reception, we were introduced to the city, where the beauty of the mansions and gardens caused us much admiration. Everything there was pure and full of peace. 2. We were received in the royal palace, built on Mount Zion. There a new surprise awaited us. 3. The great throne room was all adorned with representations of our victory over enemies. There was a very long table in the middle of the room, covered by fine linen towels adorned with gold threads and precious stones. There were 304 crowns on the table, each bringing the inscription of a winner's name. In a gesture that surprised us again, Melchizedek, taking the crowns, began placing them on the head of each of us, starting with Lot and his daughters. We were all admired by the fact that the king of Salem knew us individually, and by having those crowns ready long before we were victors. For I watched the joy of my crowned companions, when taking a crown similar to his, the king of Salem addressed me with a smile. As I lifted it over my head, I noticed something that I had not perceived until then. His hands brought deep wound scars. Overcome by a feeling of gratitude, I fell at his feet and, moved, kissed his kind hands, bathing them with my tears. 5. When I got up, I asked him the meaning of those scars. With a tender smile, he promised that he would tell me the whole story of that prosperous kingdom, and how much it cost him to obtain his peace. 6. After being crowned, Melchizedek made us sit around the great table, and began to serve us bread and wine. From that moment, we began to honor him as priest of the Most High God. 7. In a gesture of gratitude, I took the vase full of pearls and placed it at the king's feet. Taking him in his arms, he began to caress him without attempting to shine the pearls. Expressing gratitude for that offering, he told me that he would accept the vase and that of the pearls he would only accept tithing. 8. Immediately I began to count the jewels, separating the most beautiful for the king. There were a total of 1,440 pearls, of which I handed him 144. He carefully put them away in a little box made of pure gold, on whose lid were beautiful ornaments inlaid with small precious stones. 9. After receiving the tithe that symbolized the great liberation operated by Yahweh in the plain, Melchizedek called to come to him one of his subjects who was a master in ornaments and paintings, ordering him to honor the vase with a beautiful engraving that portrayed the moment in which I offered it. 10. While the jug was painted, Melchizedek began telling me the story of his kingdom, from its foundation until that moment when we were commemorating the great victory over the enemies. 11. When I returned the vase, now honored with the most beautiful engraving and inscriptions that exalted justice, humility, and love, the king of Salem ordered me to take the vase with those pearls with me. For 6 years I and my pastors should tell everyone the story of that vase that was victorious because of the flame of the altar. To all those who, with repentance, accept the salvation represented by their history, we should offer a pearl. At the end of the 6 years, the pearls would be over. There would be no chance of salvation. Then the 7th year would come, in which there would be a time of great anguish and destruction, when there would only be protection for those who possessed the pearls. By that occasion, the cities of the plain would be totally destroyed by the fire of the judgment, and the other towns that did not regret would be decimated by great plagues. Chapter 7. The revelations of Melchizedek continue. Events to be verified in Rosh Hashanah, in Yom Kippur, and in the Feast of Sukkot. 6 years of opportunity. The sanctification of the Sabbath, a sign of covenant with Yahweh. The New Jerusalem revealed at the end of 7th year, the coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the deceased faithful, and transformation of the victorious living coronation of the righteous in the holy city. See Chrono. 3. 1. On the triumph we had just obtained over numerous armies, Melchizedek, after repeating to me the words spoken by the Messiah, set a sign that would be important for those who lived for the occasion of the great liberation of Israel. He affirmed that, multiplying the 144 pearls of tithing by the number of columns in his palace, he would find the year that would bring to his consummation the great liberation of Israel. Moved by curiosity, I immediately began to count the columns. They were 40 marble columns, adorned with precious stones. 2. Upon returning to the king with the result of the calculations, he began making predictions about the great events that would take place at the end of that year. 3. When the fullness of time arrives, all human efforts in search of peace will be frustrated. At that time, numerous nations will ally themselves against the kingdom of Salem. There will be a battle like never before, and the whole earth will be punished by fire. After exhausting them all the resources in their defense, Israel will see, with despair, countless enemies marching against them, with the purpose of eliminating them. Like Lot on their night of anguish, they will see their hope die, when in Rosh Hashanah, the harmonious chords of a lute, played by a Bedouin from the tribe of Tamareh, must be heard in the middle of the ruins of Salem. His music will revive faith and hope in a better world, where nation will not rise against nation, where tears, pain, and death will no longer exist. For after comforting the afflicted with the chords of his lute, the Bedouin will take the vase with the scrolls of David's grave, and carry it on his shoulders. On that day his feet will be on the Mount of Olives, and, crying out for the liberation of Israel, there will be a strong earthquake that will crack the mount in half, emerging from the east to the west a huge valley. On that day all the land of Israel will be heavily shaken, ensuing a total destruction for all enemy armies. There will, however, be salvation for all those who, with repentance, took refuge under the Eternal's wings, throwing away the instruments of violence. 5. All mankind will witness with horror the scenes of the liberation of the children of Israel. On that day many peoples and powerful nations will be established next to Yahweh of armies. Crowds of the diaspora Jews will approach, saying, "We will go with you because we know that the Eternal is on your side." 6. The Yom Kippur that will follow liberation will be a day of purification of the impurities of all those who accepted salvation. On that day the blindness of the sons of Jacob will end, and they will look toward him whom they pierced, and they will cry bitterly for him as he cries for an only begotten son. 7. At the Feast of Sukkot, crops, the Spirit of God will be poured out on all flesh, and it will happen that everyone who invokes the name of Yahweh will be saved, receiving a pearl from the vase. 8. In the decor of the days of Sukkot, rains of blessings will fall on the immense valley, causing a paradise full of joy and peace to appear in the sight of all the peoples, throughout the Holy Land. 9. On that day the elect of God will understand the words of the book. 10. Hear me, you who seek justice, you who seek Yahweh. Look to the rock from which you were dug, to the cave from which you were taken. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah, the one that he gave birth. He was alone when I called him, but I blessed him and multiplied him. Yahweh comforted Zion, comforted all his ruins. He will transform his desert into an Eden and his solitude into a garden, where he will find joy and joy, thanksgiving chants and music sounds. 11. On that day the redeemed will look toward the humble Bedouin who freed Abraham's vase from the cave, and will sing with joy. 12. How beautiful they are, on the mountains, the feet of the messenger who announces peace, of the one who proclaims good news and announces salvation, of the one who says to Zion, O your God reigns. Because Yahweh comforted his people, he redeemed Jerusalem. Yahweh discovered his holy arm in the eyes of all nations, and all the ends of the earth will see the salvation of our God. 13 For 6 years, all mankind, illuminated by the greater revelation of Yahweh's love and justice, will have the opportunity to break with the empire of sin, joining the children of Israel in their march of purification and restoration of the kingdom of light. 14 Then it will happen that all the survivors of the nations that marched against Jerusalem will rise year after year, to prostrate themselves before King Yahweh of armies, and to celebrate the feast of Sukkot. And it will happen that the one among the families of the earth who does not come up and does not come, will attract against herself the plague with which Yahweh will hurt the nations that do not come up to celebrate the feast of Sukkot. 15 In those years of opportunity, the last treat of mercy will sound throughout the world, in an attempt for all sinners to repent and unite in an eternal alliance with Yahweh, saying, 16 Thus says Yahweh, observe the right and practice justice, because my salvation is ready to come and my justice to manifest. Blessed is the man who proceeds in this way, and the son of the man who affirms this, who keeps the Sabbath and do not desecrate him, and he keeps his hand from practicing evil. Don't tell the foreigner that he gave himself to Yahweh. Naturally Yahweh is going to exclude me from his people. Or say the eunuch, there is no doubt I do not pass a dry tree. Thus says Yahweh to the eunuchs who keep my Saturdays and opt for what is my will, remaining faithful to my covenant. I must give them, in my house and within my walls, a monument and a name more precious than they would have as sons and daughters. I have to give them an eternal name which will not be removed. And as for foreigners who surrender to Yahweh to serve him, yes, to love the name of Yahweh and become his servants, namely, all who refrain from desecrating the Sabbath and who remain faithful to my covenant, I will bring you to my holy mountain and cover you with joy in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be well accepted on my altar. In effect, my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. 17 In the 6 years of opportunity, Samuel, the great deceiver, in a gesture of despair, will use all possible resources to prevent the realization of Yahweh through his people. In opposition to the sanctification of the Sabbath, which is the sign of the covenant between Yahweh and his chosen ones, numerous religions, allied to impious rulers, will impose another day for worship, not being able to buy or sell all those who remain faithful to the covenant of Yahweh in those years of trials. The elect of God will survive by caring for the angels, who will lead them away from the populous cities that will be punished for the last 7 plagues that will fall on the unrepentant at the end of the 6 years. 18 During the 6 years of the final harvest, the Messiah will build a new and eternal Jerusalem, adorning it with the acts of justice of his elect. That new Jerusalem will only be revealed when all divine justice is completed, at the end of the 7th year, a period in which the elect of God will have as a challenge to live a life without guilt, since any act of rebellion at that time would be without atonement, meaning eternal shame for the Creator. 19 At the end of the 7 years, the Messiah will appear in the clouds of heaven, accompanied by all the heavenly hosts. By playing his trumpet on that great Rosh Hashanah, the deceased faithful will rise in glory, the victorious living will be transformed in the blink of an eye, receiving perfect bodies. Together, all the redeemed will be raptured into the New Jerusalem, on an unforgettable journey that will begin on the first day of the Sukkot festival, after 7 days of happy ascension. They will arrive in the holy city to commemorate, before the throne, the 8th day of the party. As if it were a dream, the rescued of the Lord will enter the holy city, finding on their north side the Garden of Eden, in the middle of which Mount Zion rises, the place of Yahweh's throne. Crowned by the Messiah, the redeemed will sing the song of victory, making the chords of their harps, lutes and flutes vibrate throughout the space. Chapter 8. Melchizedek's predictions continue. Abraham and his shepherds proclaim the salvation represented by the history of the vase and its redemptive flame. They grant pearls to believers. A time of opportunity before the calamity. The pearls of the vase did not have meaning to Sarah. One after uttering all these predictions, Melchizedek told me that all the experience we were living was prefigurative. For the whole drama to be consummated, we still had important events ahead of us. First, I should return to the Mamre oak together with my shepherds, to proclaim to all the salvation represented by the history of that vase. Anyone who, with repentance, accepted the revealed Messiah, would obtain forgiveness of their sins, receiving a pearl. At the end of 6 years, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, the pearls would be finished, there being no more chance of salvation. At that time, the fire of judgment would fall on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, with terrible plagues upon all the infidels. 2. When I heard such words from the king of Salem, great anguish came upon me, when I remembered Sarah's last steps. I feared that she, in her disbelief, would not accept a pearl. If this happened, my beautiful dreams would fall to the ground because I would not be happy in his absence. Reading in my eyes the anguish, Melchizedek comforted me with a promise. 3. Abram, 6 years from now Yahweh will visit you in your store, and your wife will be cured of her sterility. She will convert and give you a son named Isaac. For at the end of the Sukkot party, we returned to our stores next to the Mamre oak. As we went along the road, many people surrounded us, admired by the beauty of the vase full of pearls. We all told the story of his redemptive flame, and offered the pearls to all who, believing, accepted salvation. 5. When we arrived at the Mamre oak, a crowd of people waited for him. Many had heard of the miraculous liberation operated through that vase that had been the target of so much contempt. Now, everyone was muted to see him glorified. 6. Together with my pastors, we continue to proclaim the infinite love of Yahweh revealed by the flame. The number of those who sought pearls was increasing, day after day, and we were all happy. 7. The days, months and years went by, and the amount of pearls was decreasing inside the vase. We were living now the last months of the 6th year, which was the last chance. As the days went by, a worry and anguish increased in my heart, for Sarah had not taken interest in seizing her pearl in spite of my constant pleas. 8. In those moments of affliction in which I cried out to God for the salvation of Sarah, my only consolation was the last words of the king of Salem, that at the end of the 6 years she would be transformed. 9. We lived now the last days of the 6th year. The awareness that time was running out made many people procure me from morning to night to seize the pearls of salvation. With my heart wounded by inexpressible affliction, I insisted with Sarah, trying to convince her of her need to take as soon as possible a pearl, because they were becoming scarcer every day. Regardless of my anguish, Sarah disdained my requests, affirming that those pearls had no meaning for her. Chapter 9. Abraham tries to convince Sarah without success. Abraham receives 3 pilgrims with hospitality. The Lord converts Sarah and blesses him, gives him 2 pearls, one for her and one for his son. Abraham falls at the feet of his Redeemer and receives the last pearl. 1. After a sleepless night in which, desperately, I tried to convince my beloved to take possession of her pearl, accepting the salvation represented by that vase, I saw the sun rise bringing the light of the last day, the eve of Rosh Hashanah. Looking into the vase that morning, I saw that there were barely 3 pearls left. When I admired the brightness, I began to imagine that the brightest would be for my promised son, that of intermediate brightness would be Sarah's, and the last one would be mine. That thought brought me relief and hope, but at the same time I began to worry about the possibility of people arriving trying to get them. If they came, I could not deny them the right to them. Too taken by that concern, I sat under the Mamre oak. During the day, a great shudder came upon me when I saw in the distance 3 pilgrims walking towards our shop. I began to cry out to God that they change course, but my cries were not answered. Dominated by great bitterness, I ran to them, and after prostrating myself, invited them into the shadow. 3. Taking a vase with water, I began to wash their feet, cleaning them from the dust of the road. Seeing the wounded and blistered feet of those men, I felt compassion for them. I understood that they had come from far away, facing dangers and challenges, in order to get the pearls on time. I saw that they were much more deserving than me, Sarah, and our promised son. For by washing the feet of the 3rd, my heart that until then was afflicted, was filled with peace and joy. I imagined at that time, how terrible it would be if that 3rd pilgrim had not joined the first 2 on that journey. In that case I would be obliged to take the last pearl, climbing without my beloved Salem. If I had to go through that experience, the pearl that symbolized the joy of salvation, would become for me a symbol of loneliness and sadness, because the long life of Sarah's affection would be for me the greatest punishment, like my own death. 5. After washing their feet, I began serving them the food that was specially prepared for them. While serving them in silence, I was waiting for the moment when they would ask me about the pearls. But without revealing any hurry, they talked about the long walk they made, about the cities they had passed through. I asked them if they knew Salem. They answered me affirmatively, adding that in those 6 years, many works had been carried out in that city, in preparation for a great party that was about to take place in another year, for the occasion of Sukkot. 6. The words of that 3rd pilgrim, the most talkative of the 3, began to bring me, mysteriously, a feeling of hope. Looking into his blue eyes, I saw that he looked like Melchizedek. 7. I remembered the last promise made by the king of Salem, when the 3rd pilgrim asked me with a smile. 8. Abram, where is Sarah your wife? 9. Stunned, I asked him. 10. How do you know my name and my wife's name? 11. The pilgrim replied. 12. Not only do I know your names, but I also know that, within a year, you will have a son who will be called Isaac. 13. When I heard the words of the visitor, I ran into the store to call my wife, to hear the words of the pilgrim. 14. When he saw her, the pilgrim asked him. 15. Sarah, why are you laughing at my words? 16. Scared, Sarah replied. 17. I did not laugh, my lord. 18. Don't say you didn't laugh, because I saw you laughing inside the store. The pilgrim affirmed. 19. Conscious of being in front of someone who knew his interior, Sarah asked him. 20. Who are you, Lord? 21. I am the flame that broke away from the fire of the altar to be in your husband's vase. I am the Messiah, the Yahweh who suffers humiliation and contempt for love of his people. 22. Having made this revelation, the pilgrim extended his hands over Sarah's head to bless her. Only until then I saw that they were marked by scars similar to those of the king of Salem. 23. The pilgrim, with much tenderness, began to speak to the heart of my beloved, rescuing her from her cave of disbelief. 24. Sarah, you are valuable in my eyes. All your past of disbelief and infertility is forgiven. I have a glorious future for you will become the mother of many peoples and nations. 25. After saying these words, the noble visitor went to the vase and, bowing, took from him the 3 remaining pearls. Addressing Sarah, he handed her 2 pearls and said, 26. One is for you and the other is for your son Isaac. 27. With life transformed by Yahweh's love, Sarah prostrated herself at the feet of the pilgrim who had saved her at the last moment of opportunity. When I saw her prostrate submissive, my heart for so many years afflicted, it broke into tears of joy and gratitude, and I fell at the feet of my Redeemer and King. 28. After comforting us with the certainty of our eternal salvation, the pilgrim handed me the last pearl. When I squeezed it in my hands, I felt a great light of joy and peace penetrate my whole being, and I began to praise the Eternal for the certainty that I would forever have my dear Sarah and the son of the promise that, within 1 year, would be born. Chapter 10. Abraham accompanies the Lord to the hill from where the Lord sends his 2 companions on a mission. Yahweh laments the destruction that will come to the inhabitants of the cities of that beautiful valley. Abraham intercedes for that people. There were not 10 righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. Yahweh's lamentation. The 2 companions are sent to rescue Lot and his daughters. Abraham prostrates himself thankful to Yahweh for the intervention in the rescue of his relatives. One after these things, Yahweh said goodbye to Sarah and the shepherds who were there, and invited me to accompany them to the hill facing the valley. When we arrived at that place, the Eternal said goodbye to his 2 companions, sending them on a special mission in Sodom. 2. From the top of the mountain we contemplated the fertile valleys and forests that, like a paradise, stretched on both banks of the Jordan River, surrounding the thriving cities, within which Sodom and Gomorrah stood out. 3. It was on that hill that, after the fight between my shepherds and the shepherds of Lot, I gave him the opportunity to choose the course to follow, because we could not stay together. Attracted by the riches of the countryside, he decided to move there. For looking at my companion who remained silent from the moment we saw the countryside, I was surprised to see him crying. I asked him the reason for his sadness, and he, sobbing, replied, 5. This is for me a very sad day, for the last time my eyes can rest on this fertile valley. I cry for the inhabitants of those cities who don't know their days will end. 6. Yahweh's statement brought back the memory of all those captives who had been released 6 years before. Unfortunately, almost everyone rejected the purification bath, returning filthy to their homes. Only Lot and his daughters accepted salvation, taking possession of their pearls. Thinking about some possibility of liberation for that people, I asked the Lord, 7. And if there are in those cities 50 just people, would they still be destroyed? 8. Yahweh told me that if there were 50 righteous, the entire plain would be forgiven. 9. What if there are 45 fair? 10. If there were 45 righteous, all those cities would be forgiven. 11. I continued with my inquiries until I reached number 10. Yahweh told me that if there were 10 righteous in those cities, the entire plain would be forgiven. 12. Tortured by an inexpressible agony of spirit, Yahweh again wept bitterly, while in a seized voice he uttered a sad regret. 13. Sodoma and Gomorrah, how many times I wanted to gather your children, like the chicken that gathers its chicks under its wings, but you did not accept my protection. Why is it that you changed the light of my salvation for the darkness of this kingdom of death? My ears are attentive in search of at least one prayer, but everything is silence. My hands are extended, ready to prevent the fire of judgment, but you reject my help. 14. Leaning next to my suffering companion, I joined him in lamentation. In that moment of pain, I was certain that Melchizedek also suffered for all those who had changed the love and peace of Salem, for the illusions of that valley of destruction. 15 After a long cry, Yahweh comforted me with the revelation of his two companions. They were at that time in Sodom, with the mission of saving Lot and his daughters, freeing them from death. His words brought me great relief, and I fell grateful to his feet. Chapter 11. Yahweh commissioned Abraham to record in a scroll the history of the vase, as well as the history of Salem, to later deliver it inside the vase to Melchizedek. Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham laments in extreme. 1 Before leaving, Yahweh commissioned me with a mission, saying, 2. Take an empty scroll and record in it the history of the vase and the history of Salem, as you heard from Melchizedek's lips. Within a year, you and all those who will accept salvation must go up to Salem for Sukkot's feast. On that day they will return the vase to the king of Salem, offering the scroll inside him as a present. 3 That same afternoon, in obedience to Yahweh's orders, I began to record the story lived by me and my shepherds, from the moment I left for the valley, carrying the vase with its flare on its back. For the next day the sun was already high, when, mentioning the city of Sodom in the manuscript, I remembered that this was the day of its destruction. With my heart racing, I ran over there and was frightened by the scenario that stretched before my eyes. Instead of that fertile valley similar to a paradise, there was a smoking desert, lifeless. Instead of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, there was a deep crater where the salty sea waters dripped. 5 Broken at that vision of destruction, I returned to the store with a sad heart. The memory of so many people who, by rejecting divine forgiveness, had been consumed by fire, left me deeply weakened. In the following days I found no strength to write. I returned to the hill other times, hoping that all this was a nightmare, but instead of the fertile valley I could only perceive that chaos. 6 It took several days for me to return to the spirit of continuing with the writings of the scroll.